I have been looking forward to this sermon perhaps as much as any sermon I have ever preached. About 2 months ago, Donna Ward and Minda, we sat in this room together and we read this passage of Scripture in Luke chapter 8. We meditated on it. And then we read it a second time, and we put ourselves in the story, imagined to be characters in the story. And then we read it a third time, and we let the text read us, not putting ourselves over the text of the gospel, but to let the gospel read us. It's called Lectio Divina. It's one of the ancient practices of the church, is to meditate on Scripture like this. And Minda and Donna had so many amazing insights that I actually thought about trying to recreate our conversation for you today, because I thought you'd be blown away. But then I thought, there's no way you can recreate moments like that. It would sound forced and rehearsed and scripted. I don't often quote conservative theologians, but Karl Barth actually says that when the word comes alive, the moment of the word, it's an event. And it's the difference between a lightning bug and lightning. We had a lightning bolt that night. We knew that God's Spirit had been with us, and that Spirit, which we believe inspired this text, illuminated this text and spoke again to us. It was powerful. Now, having said that, I don't know how good today's sermon is going to be. So what I thought we would do is I would read you the story. So this is story time with Uncle Bo. I'm going to read it to you. And then I'm just going to tell you a couple things that stood out to me. As we have been going through the Gospel of Luke, we have jumped ahead to chapter 8 here. And next week, we actually go back to chapter 1. For Advent, we're entering into the Nativity story again. So this is sort of our last week up here at the 10:30 hour in our worship gathering, dealing with Luke. And so I wanted to walk you through this. So let me read you the story. It's from Luke chapter 8, beginning in verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then, there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. As he went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhaging stopped. And then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and they press in on you." But Jesus said, No, someone touched me, for I noticed that the power had gone out from me. And when the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Shalom. While he was still speaking, someone came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." And when Jesus heard this, he said, "Don't fear, only believe, and she will be saved." And when he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. and they were all weeping and wailing for her. But Jesus said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But Jesus took her by the hand, and he called out, "Child, arise." Her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And then he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. There are so many interesting things going on in this text. Far more than I can possibly draw out for you today. But as we have been going through the Gospel of Luke, I have been proposing to you that Luke is an artist. He is a weaver, if you will. He's making a rug, a tapestry, and he's taking threads that he found in the Gospel of Mark, which he had, and which he found in doing eyewitness interviews, because he was sort of a reporter. And he wove them together, and he's telling us a story. I've compared it to being a quilter, where you're stitching together these pieces in a really deliberate way in order to present, right, a finished image, a product. Or a cross stitch, where you're doing the work behind the scenes in order to make something appear on the other side. Right? Those have been our word pictures we've used. And nowhere is that more obvious than in today's story. So let's just walk through it a little bit. Let's walk through Luke's storytelling for us. So you have this woman. She's a young woman. In fact, at 12, she has only just become a woman. And she is the front parenthesis in this story. And then while Jesus is on his way to attend to that emergency, another woman shows up. And she's the one who actually gets the lion's share of the press here. Her story is more elaborate, it's longer, there are more details. But we know, as the reader, that there's two other women waiting in silence. The little girl who has just died and her mother. So Jesus attends to this miraculous encounter that he has with this woman who's been bleeding for how many years?
12.
Wait, isn't there another 12 in this story?
Yes.
Does anyone else think that's weird? Coincidence? No. It's part of the same story. For the woman who had been with menstrual bleeding for 12 years is inside the story of this young woman who had only come into that season of her life and had become a young woman. In that community, that's how it worked. Luke pairs these stories together because he wants us to see them as speaking to one another. It's not coincidence when you're reading scripture and something seems too convenient. If you've ever been reading something and you're like, I wonder how they knew there was that many people in the crowd, or how they had lived that many years, or, right? If you see a number and it seems too convenient, pay attention to it. The author is trying to tell you something. Don't dismiss it or discount it as ironic or poetic or convenient, right? No, pick up on it. Put a little pin there to remember it. Luke has paired these two stories because they speak to one another. This woman the second woman who comes in and in the most daring way sneaks up behind Jesus. You have to understand what was on the line for her. She had been outside of connection, outside of sacred community, outside of spiritual acceptability, religious involvement for 12 years because of the religious code they lived by. She should not have been in that crowd because if she touched anyone else, they got infected. They became unclean. She shouldn't have been there at all. She was supposed to stay outside of town, where people in her condition had a place of refuge that they were supposed to be. So she comes in, breaking this social taboo and this religious expectation. And in a daring act of amazing faith, she sneaks up behind the teacher and touches the hem of his garment. And you thought she would get away with it. She got what she wanted. It's amazing. Except Jesus noticed something. I sense a disturbance in the force. Who touched me? And don't we love Peter? Peter is us in the story. He's always saying the thing we would be thinking but didn't have the guts to say. So Pete blurts out, Jesus, God, man, look at all these people. What are you talking about? Everyone's touching you. Jesus said, no. This was different. There's something different. And she knows she's busted. So she shows her cards. She says, "This is me. But understand what's happening." She tells her story. So here's the thing. She is one model of faith for us because she took matters into her own hands and in an act of bravery and desperation and fortitude, she pursued what she needed and she got it. She is one model of faith for us. But then, Jesus turns his attention to this other story, which has been put on pause for a moment, to a different kind of faith, to a young woman who couldn't ask for help. Her voice didn't work. She was in desperate need and couldn't go find the healer. She couldn't take matters into her own hands. She had been paralyzed or marginalized. She was stuck. And somebody had to have faith on her behalf, in her stead. This is a second kind of faith. This is a second kind of faith because I'm betting that everyone in this room right now has been at a place where you were trapped or felt paralyzed or were immobile or had lost your voice and couldn't even ask for the thing you needed most. She's in somebody else's hands. That's another model of faith. It's why we need each other. Sometimes we can't even ask for the thing we need the most. It's why we're part of a body, a community. And then there's a third woman in the story who's totally anonymous, except by her relationship to the young woman. She is a mother, and we never know her name, and we never hear her voice. And that's a type of faith too, to be present and to witness. That's a participatory type of faith. And in these three women, Luke has quilted together, woven a story of faith that sometimes looks one way and sometimes looks another. But the thing I want you to hear about how both of these stories resolve, this is my favorite part. Both of these women had been outside of connection and excluded from community by their situation, by their circumstances. They had been isolated. And in faith, they were both restored to love, to connection, to relationship, to sacred community. It's a powerful story. This woman had been bleeding for 12 years. This other young woman had only been alive for 12 years. And they both had been excluded from the thing they needed most. And in faith, they were restored to connection and belonging and participation. And these women, for us, are models of faith. Because sometimes life asks us to put our big boots on and get busy and work hard and grab the bull by the horns and demand what we need. That's one kind of faith. It's not a passive faith. That's a very active faith. Sometimes you got to conspire with yourself to get out of your circumstances. And then there's another type of faith, which is passive. It's paralyzed, trapped. And in that case, you need people to work on your behalf and to go in your stead. Because in the end, both of these stories restore people to connection and relationship and participation. I love this story. I'm grateful that Luke wove it together the way he did. I'm grateful to Donna and Minda for sitting in this text with me. And I hope that you're encouraged today. I hope that you will maybe read this story again later this week and see if it speaks to you. Then I hope you'll read it a third time and see if the text reads you. It's a really good experiment. And I am grateful for this story. And I pray that it increases each of our faith, no matter what season of life we're in, and that it reminds us that we need to be looking out for those who can't even ask for what they need the most, and to be interceding on their behalf to restore them to connection and relationship and participation in community. Amen.